The modern world is looking at a man who has shattered his hands trying to lift an immovable boulder, and it is subsequently indicting the boulder for assault. Okay, how striking is that metaphor? It's practically cinematic, and it comes straight from the text we're unpacking today. We're going to dive into a deeply thought-provoking answer to a question that has basically baffled global leaders for generations. You know the one, why does modern diplomacy consistently seem to hit a brick wall in the Middle East? Well, let's look at a perspective that challenges the very foundation of modern statecraft. Today, we're breaking down the core thesis of a book titled The Prophetic Asymmetry, Decoding the Biblical Mechanics of the Middle East. And what makes this analysis so intriguing is its approach. The author argues that we really need to strip away our cultural biases, the shifting political opinions, and frankly, these failing diplomatic traditions. Instead of analyzing the Near East through the lens of modern politics, the book suggests we look at the ongoing conflict as an observable fulfillment of an ancient, dual prophetic framework. It's a totally different paradigm. It treats these ancient texts not as religion, but as literal, observable data. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the failed science, or the materialist misdiagnosis. To really understand this framework, we have to look at what the book calls a century of failed statecraft. And let's start with this stark number, 0%. According to the book, for over a century, the greatest diplomatic minds have approached the Middle East like it's just a standard puzzle of political science. The prevailing doctrine assumes that humans everywhere are universally driven by the exact same material desires. The thought process is basically, hey, if you redraw the borders equitably, toss in some economic incentives, and adjudicate historical grievances, the region will inevitably stabilize. But the author makes the bold claim that a century of this secular, cartographic, and economic appeasement has yielded exactly a 0% success rate. Observable history, they argue, has utterly falsified the hypothesis of modern diplomacy. So, the author argues that international bodies, like the UN, routinely misdiagnose regional friction. Why? Because they assume the conflict is just some modern anomaly sparked by recent events. They apply materialist medicine, like redrawing borders and signing treaties, to treat a metaphysical reality. It's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. By completely discarding ancient texts as just archaic religious relics, global leaders are ignoring the fact that these texts actually function as precise, predictive blueprints for the sociological behavior of entire lineages. Moving right along to Section 2, the Prophetic Diagnostic Tool, an alternative framework. So if the modern tools of political science are failing so badly, what exactly is the alternative? Well, to determine the unbiased truth of the Middle East, the author outlines a very specific objective methodology. The goal here is to set aside the shifting consensus of modern culture and instead apply formal logic and observable historical science to test foundational biblical data. Specifically, the book zeroes in on Genesis 16 and Zechariah 12. The author asserts that when you look at these texts objectively, you don't find vague poetry. Nope, you find a precise diagnostic tool that perfectly maps two opposing forces in the region. Which brings us to Section 3, the kinetic force, the Ishmaelite paradigm. Now, the first half of this dual prophetic framework focuses on an outward, expanding energy. The book performs a linguistic and logical exegesis of Genesis 16:12 to define the term para. This translates to the wild donkey mechanic. And the author points out, this isn't an insult at all. Rather, it's an ancient sociological metric defining a state of profound, untamable independence. This mechanic creates a kinetic, multi-directional hostility. It's an outward active force where, just as the text predicts, his hand will be against every man. To back this up, the book traces this prophecy of multi-directional friction across observable history to show that, yeah, it's a constant pattern. It maps this internalized hostility starting from pre-Islamic tribal raiding, known as Ghazwa, accelerating right into the rapid military expansion of the early caliphates. But it definitely doesn't stop in the ancient world. The author points to modern conflicts, the Iran-Iraq War, the Syrian Civil War, and the centuries-old Sunni-Shia schism. All of this demonstrates that this hostility toward all his brothers is a continuous kinetic motion. And here's the key, it is entirely independent of Western intervention. All right, let's look at the other side in Section 4, the gravitational force, the Israelite paradigm. Obviously, a dual framework requires two parts to actually create friction, right? So to define this second opposing force, the book turns to Zechariah 12:2-3. It defines the posture of a restored Israel not as some conquering empire, but as the basin of reeling or a cup of trembling. Through a logical audit, the author highlights that this prophesied posture is profoundly different from the kinetic force we just looked at. Actually, it's the exact opposite. It's entirely inward, passive, and reactive. It acts as a heavy gravitational anchor firmly placed in the region rather than an expanding outward energy. So, the absolutely crucial point here is how these two forces interact when they finally meet. The book asserts that when surrounding nations sustain massive damage in this conflict, it isn't actually the result of standard aggressive warfare on Israel's part. Instead, the author argues it's just the mathematical consequence of finite actors attempting to forcibly displace a divinely anchored coordinate. Think about it. It's the self-inflicted ruin of hitting that immovable boulder we talked about at the very beginning of this explainer. When we place these two forces side by side, the startling asymmetry becomes super clear. On one side, we've got the Ishmaelite posture, outward, kinetic, and multidirectional. On the other side, the Israelite posture, inward, reactive, and gravitational. The diagnostic tool maps their interactions perfectly. It shows us exactly what happens when a highly active, untamable force persistently collides with a deeply entrenched, passive anchor. The book argues that recognizing this stark contrast in agency is literally the only way to truly understand the mechanics of the Middle East. And that leads us right into our final part, Section 5, the ultimate variable, the subtraction test. This brings us to what is perhaps the most revealing analysis in the text, applying Occam's razor to test the validity of this entire framework. The author poses a simple but profound subtraction test to us. If the state of Israel were completely removed from the map tomorrow, would the Middle East suddenly achieve peace? What happens if you take the immovable boulder completely out of the equation? Does the friction just stop? Well, the book's conclusion is definitive. No. Even without the gravitational center, the kinetic friction, and internalized hostility, that untamable wild donkey mechanic would persist entirely independent of Israel. The author argues that secular diplomacy suffers from a massive inversion of causality. You see, international governing bodies assume that Israel is the root cause of the regional friction. However, the ancient texts, backed by the observable history of internal conflicts we mapped earlier, suggest that the multi-directional hostility exists completely regardless of the boulder's presence. And that brings us to this incredibly impactful takeaway from the text. Treating a prophetic reality with secular materialist medicine will always fail. The author maintains that until the international community actually acknowledges this dual prophetic framework, treaty after treaty and resolution after resolution will just continue to fail. You simply cannot cure a metaphysical reality by throwing economic incentives at it or trying to arbitrarily redraw a map on a piece of paper. We started this explainer with the image of a man shattering his hands on an immovable boulder and then blaming the rock for the damage. So I leave you with this final provocative question posed by the book's thesis. What happens to global diplomacy when the world finally stops indicting the boulder? It is a paradigm-shifting way to look at one of the world's most complex regions. Regardless of your personal worldview or politics, this framework certainly challenges the traditional assumptions of modern statecraft and forces us to look at ancient data in a brand new light. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the frameworks around you.